Hello. We're very excited to do this panel. I am not going to do their bios, but I do want to mention a couple of interesting things about these amazing women that we're so fortunate to hear today. Alicin was awarded Woman of Influence by Essence magazine. She also received a commendation from the City of New York for women's leadership. Jen was recently awarded by the Alliance for Women in Media a Gracie Leadership Award. Thai was a Variety Women of Impact, and she was also an Entrepreneur's Women of Impact. And these women are quoted in all kinds of amazing publications, and you're going to get a lot of their insights about how to be innovators and entrepreneurs. So let's just start. Thank you. So let's just start with what Innovate means to the three of you, and what skills you think it takes to be an innovator. So Thai, would you like to begin?
Sure. Good morning. I love a good alliteration, so I was thinking about that coming into this conversation. And I think there are a few key hallmarks of innovation, or at least through my career there have been. One has been inclusion, not from a goodwill perspective, but from a good business perspective, getting diverse stakeholders at the table, a diversity of opinions and perspectives to really reflect whatever market is that you're trying to serve is really essential. I think number two is insight. So I try to root every decision in data or some human truth when I'm thinking about how to break molds or barriers. But ultimately, a lot of it comes down to instinct, and that's what does your gut say? And as women, so often we've been socialized not to trust our guts, but because we influence 80% of consumer spending and 85% of cultural trends, there is just an inherent wealth of knowledge and innovative ideas that sit within us, and we already move markets. And so to leverage that insight and all of that experience to bring new ideas to the table, I think is super important.
Thank you. Jen, what does innovation mean to you, and what skills do you think you need?
Well, innovation at its core is really making things better, and either taking a new idea and making a service better, a product better. And I agree with everything Thai said. In my experience, I think innovation has really been about risk-taking, this willingness to take risks, but also that has to be coupled with a willingness to make mistakes and to fail fast, figure it out, and move on. And I think, especially as women, that's an uncomfortable space for us. And it's an uncomfortable space for most people. And so when you can combine that willingness with failures and recovery from that, you can get some really great innovation.
And some people say you learn more from a failure than a success.
100%, 100%. When I look back in my life at the things that have stood out as failures, they've led to better innovation. And if you look at products and great inventions, whether it's something in the health track or just things like a light bulb, et cetera, you'll find that at least 50% of them were either by accident or they were striving for one thing, they ended up with something else, and you got a great innovation out of it. So limiting yourself to exactly what you know and exactly what you think is going to be right and be successful really cuts off innovation.
Alicin.
Well, first, I plus one everything that Thai and Jen said, and the only thing that I would add is the ability to reimagine, right? Like, it's actually hard. We sort of are operating with the things that are presented to us, and I think a really important skill in innovation and the way that I think about it is, what if we just wiped that away and started from a different perspective or different understanding? And I think that actually has the opportunity to allow us to just then push through a lot of the things that hold us back, the things that keep us from, so many from thriving, but generally really just reimagining what something could be and starting from there.
I love that reimagining because I always feel like at least I create stories in my head of why it can't happen, you know, versus just clearing the deck and saying, well, what do I want to have happen? You know?
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in addition to reimagining, I think it's reframing, because pretty much any problem that I've ever encountered, the other side of that coin is a possibility, right? Yeah. And so, you know, whatever you're given, look at it, think about it, like you said, from the other side. And most of the big leaps have been from those real problem areas where I've hit a wall in a business strategy, I've hit a wall from a career perspective, and on the other side of that problem was a possibility that I probably hadn't imagined initially.
Jen, I like that you were speaking about how you think ahead of what might go wrong, and I think that can be very helpful in dealing with the naysayers. So we all know that there's often people that doubt you, that are not supportive of you, people that like the norm, they don't like change. So why don't we start with you, Ty, on how you deal with, how you have dealt with those people that are the naysayers in the room?
You know, I try to much of my confidence is rooted in competence, right? And I think that's true for a lot of women. I wish I could say that I always take the leap without doing it, but I sort of like build my confidence along the way by proving things to myself and others, kind of land and expand and build on it. But you know, one really tangible example, I've founded and led and run several ventures with creators or talent, and one was Heartbeat in partnership with Kevin Hart. And after a couple different iterations of the business, we were going out for a big capital raise. I didn't go to B school, I was a comms major, and it was always this like private insecurity of mine, right? So I had been running the business and growing it, you know, significantly year over year, running it profitably. But when we went out for private equity for the first time, there was all this jargon that I didn't know. I didn't see myself reflected on the other side of the table, right? There weren't many women. There were very few people of color. And, you know, the first couple of pitches were kind of rocky. And then after, like, the third, I realized there's nothing that they can ask me about this business that I don't know. And I am the most qualified, while the person on the other side of the table might be able to write the check. I am the one who's going to steer the ship. And it was that competence that was built daily through trial and error, through testing and learning, through flat-out failure. It's what qualified me to be the person to lead that charge. And so, you know, I don't really say anything to naysayers. I feel like I can show you better than I can tell you.
For me, I guess at some point in my career, I stopped asking for approval. And I think that that took me a while. I studied engineering, and I didn't necessarily feel like I was qualified to be in business. And so then I got an MBA, and I thought, oh, does this make me qualified now? And that still wasn't quite enough, because there was something I was seeking, and I don't know from who or what exactly, but someone saying, oh, Jen, now you're ready to be an executive, now you're ready to be a CEO. And something turned for me, and I actually can't quite pinpoint it, but what I stopped doing is I stopped looking for approval, and I thought, no, I have an idea. I'm going to go try this. I'm not seeking approval. I'm going to explain to you what my idea is. And I'm going to go do this. And I'm going to go make myself CEO of my own startup. And that's how I'm going to get there. And that's going to be my path. And it might be successful, and it might not be successful. But it was about, I think, building that confidence over time and finding the right set of things that got me to that mental leap of, I don't need approval. I'm just going to go do this.
It's interesting, working in male-dominated environments for my 40-year career, I noticed how often the men would just tell you what they were going to do, and the women were seeking approval to do the things they wanted to do. And so one day I decided to try to get approval for something without actually asking for approval, and walking in and telling this partner, I was not a partner at the time, what I was going to do. And it was easy, and I got in that case, it was approval of what I wanted to do. And it was a game changer for me. So I think, you know, also that kind of situation where sometimes you don't necessarily have to ask for approval in that way either. Alicin.
Well, you know, and I would just add that naysayers are often, it's not because they're necessarily trying to be obstructionist. I assume they're just confused. And so they're, taking an opportunity to make it so that it's clearer what the opportunity is. And so I think there's a lot of, one of my favorite moments are when the eyes get wide open, when, people have just been doing things, or like, this is just the way that they've been done, and this is how it's supposed to go. This is what the system is, and this is what the expectation is. And so, again, sort of through that like innovative or growth mindset, you're thinking like, okay, but you think the way to get your result is by going to, this particular entity, this mayor or something, when in fact, there are other avenues to actually have the result that you're looking for and get the support that you're looking for. And so it really is, again, I try to assume best intent, but really I assume that, again, the naysayers are just temporarily embarrassed that they're confused.
I know that often women are told to have allies, to have champions. And we're often told that those should be men. And so sometimes in advance of doing something, you'll find a powerful man in that environment that you can go to, and you tell that man what you're going to be doing, so that in that room, that person is going to be your ally or champion. I'm hoping that we are going to get beyond that, and we don't feel like we need to have that male be our ally or champion. How do the three of you feel about that? Is that something that you still think is something that is valuable, that women should do that, they need to do that? By the way, can that ally or champion be a powerful woman? Like, you are all very powerful women. So if I was working with you, I might go to you and say, I have this idea, what do you think of it? Can you support me in that room?
Absolutely. I think anyone who is going to be your your champion and advocate and cheerleader, you should embrace that. And so it can be a man or a woman. And really, I often talk about my current boss now, Jim Lanzone, who's the CEO of Yahoo, as an incredible feminist. I think he has, he's an incredible leader and an incredible champion of women. And to be quite frank, there are some women who are not. And for a range of reasons, and I'm not going to judge them, but I think you find your support in people who will support you and know what that looks like and means, know what it means not to have to compromise who you are in getting that, for sure. But I absolutely believe that men and women are absolutely able to be your advocate and champion.
And I find, and I always say this about Black women, but I think this applies more broadly to women. I actually find that we're often over-mentored and under-sponsored in the allyship department. And
You're getting some feedback on that.
Yes.
I hear you.
Because everyone. There are lots of folks who will tell you how to do it, and that's very important. Like, I've modeled so much of my career after really amazing women and men who I've had the good fortune of working with. Some of those have been managers, some of those have been peers, some of those have been folks who reported to me. But at the end of the day, I always use this good fella analogy, if anyone's seen the film. But when he walks in and he's like, hey, he's a good fella, he's one of us. And at the end of the day, when you look at the systemic barriers that women are facing, still less than 11% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Less than 2% of venture funding goes to women. But when they have a male co-founder as a part of the team, that number increases 10x, right? And that's not, even though there's a McKinsey study that indicates that women in leadership in private companies perform 21% better from a profitability perspective. And so there's this incongruence. It actually has nothing to do with what you're doing, women. It has everything to do with some of the systemic barriers. So what does that mean? Do you do nothing? No, you do all the things. You find your people, you network up, down, laterally. But I would be remiss to make you think you walk out of this room and say, as long as you negotiate, as long as you advocate for yourself, as long as you find the right people, you'll move forward. Because I know so many incredibly capable, hyper-qualified women who still face those challenges, and yet you see folks on this panel and throughout this day who found a way to persevere. And so I would say keep doing what you're doing, but absolutely not just allies, but I think there's going to have to be sponsorship at the corporate level that's cross-gender to really move the needle, because when I look around at women, I think we're doing all that we can and should do plus some.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And the sponsorship to me is really key. I mean, I look for allies in whoever, wherever I can find them at all levels, of course. But when I think about how I've gotten to where I am, it's been through sponsorship. And it's not passive sponsorship. It's me advocating for myself and finding those sponsors. And when someone is willing to sponsor me also leaning in and reciprocating, so that I can get to that next level. And I think to your original question, I mean, as women, we have to look to men as sponsors and women as sponsors. I mean, I'm so often still in a room with only men and just me. So if I don't rely on male sponsors, how will I ever get there? And then how will I ever pull up other women? So that really doesn't bother me. I look for sponsors in everybody, but I do find you need to cultivate it. And sometimes the best sponsors don't even realize they're being sponsors. Yeah. It's not always intentional. And there's so many times where I've said, could I join that meeting? Mm-hmm. Or could I be included in that? And they're like, oh, yeah, sure, of course. And then it turns out that they wedge me into the opportunity when if I hadn't said something, it wouldn't have happened. Yeah. So
I love when you said also being a woman in the room and bringing other women up. And you and I spoke briefly before the panel about how many times have we been the only woman in the room, for two of you, the only people of color or women of color in the room. And we were talking about it, and I said the first time that happened to me, and I was in a room of very prominent men, and I was advising all of them, that I remembered feeling like, pat myself on the back, I'm the only woman in the room. Mm-hmm. And then I was driving home, and I said, no, this is bad. I shouldn't be the only woman in the room, and there were no people of color in that room either. And this was years ago. So hopefully those rooms are changing. But I think women like the three of you who can pull up other women, bring other women in the room, bring people of color into the room. It's critical for the change that we need to see in this industry. You talked about money a little bit already, Ty, and it's, I think, such an important topic. And the three of you are clearly, thank you. The three of you are clearly not afraid or uncomfortable, it seems, to talk about money, to raise money. So let's talk about that, because I think there are people in this room that probably have incredible ideas and maybe a little bit uncomfortable. Like, how do you talk about the funds you need for something? So Ty, why don't you go first, because you did a historic $100 million capital raise.
Wow.
Thank you. For Kevin Hart's company, and so clearly you know how to talk about money. So let's talk money.
So the first thing I will tell you is that often, in my experience, as a woman talking about money, you can be talked out of doing so boldly, right? And so whether that's salary negotiation, whether that is, fundraising, and by the way, fundraising, whether that's at the VC level and you've just got the seed of an idea and you're going to angels, or you're trying to raise that initial capital, or you're talking about more complicated private equity or exits. I mean, those are inherently tough rooms regardless of your gender or race, because, and you're playing, a game of odds, even when you're hyper qualified, even when you have all the proof. So you have to have thick skin for that regardless, and be really rooted in competency, in my experience. So whether that is the compensation that you're seeking, know the comps, right? Know what the market will bear. I don't, communicate in needs, but in value exchange. So because I want something doesn't mean someone should give it to me. And just because I'm a woman who champions other women, even if someone's negotiating negotiating with me. It could be a woman, and if you say, I want this, like, well, I want lots of things too, so why should we be exchanging? But when there is a real value exchange and you are advocating for something that you know is worthwhile, then you have to be persistent and relentless in it. It's the only way. Even when folks would tell you you're being too forward, even when folks would say you're being too persistent or too entitled, because unfortunately, and I mean, we're at a Power Women Summit, so we keep coming back to gender, many of our male counterparts don't get that same reaction. I remember the number one lesson that I've ever learned about money was from a guy who reported to me, and I was at Sony. And I had inherited this team. I had just gone I was working in the agency world before, and so I took this job at Sony. I was a VP for the first time, have this global team, and my boss had kind of given me a list of all the folks on the team with some background about them, the team that I was inheriting. And so, two things. From a sponsorship perspective, he told me this one gentleman reminded him of himself. So what did that do? It put me on notice that this is a rock star. I haven't even met him, but I already had this preconceived idea. And there was an innuendo, not the way that I read that, and not in a forceful way, but this is someone that my boss cares about. I should probably pay attention. So he comes in, and he's one of the most charming people, and we're still in touch to this day. And he tells me all the wonderful things he's doing across the business. And then he says, oh, and I'm probably due for a raise. But he tells me all the things he did. And because we were running a venture within Sony, he said, I'd like to have equity in the particular thing that I'm running. He said it so confidently, I was confused. I was like, is that possible in this construct? Like, what does he even mean? But what did he do? He put me on notice. One, he told me how competent he was. He laid out his business results. He wasn't confrontational, but because of the sponsorship that came with him, and also because of the way that he presented himself, I knew I'm going to have to deal with this guy, one way or the other, right? So either we're going to have to have a meeting of the minds around his compensation, I'm going to have to incentivize him, or we might even have to end up parting ways. And it ended up being an amazing partnership, and he did get a raise not so long after that. We set specific KPIs, and he met them. But what was that? He had the confidence and the boldness to come in and advocate for himself. He knew his worth, but what I was most impressed with was that he validated that with his contributions. And so, that was a few different examples of how and why it's so important to advocate for yourself in a deal that you would make if you were on the other side of the table too, right? Like that's just one of my rules. I never offer anything that I wouldn't ultimately be willing to take if it were offered to me.
So, Jen, you got an MBA from Harvard Business School, is that correct?
Yeah.
And you have finance experience with JP Morgan, investment banking in New York, and BV Capital in Hamburg, Germany. So you clearly were in the world of finance before you got into our crazy world of entertainment. Mm-hmm. And I know you've had opportunities where you've raised funds. Talk a bit about whether you think that background that you have was helpful to you and your approach to raising capital.
So I don't think the background was that helpful. I don't think it mattered.
That's probably music to a lot of people's ears because very few people in the room probably went to Harvard for their business school.
Well, I want to tell a story about fundraising, but I wanted to just piggyback off something Ty said because so I guess it's just some general life advice, but it also applies to fundraising, which is when you're negotiating, figure out what you want and ask for it. There definitely needs to be a value exchange, but I'm always so surprised how people launch into negotiations, launch into fundraising, and they haven't stopped to figure out what that end result is that they're looking for. And they almost negotiate against themselves, or they lose power because they're wishy-washy about it. And that was one of the things I discovered in the fundraising process of you need to be bold, but like what is your desired outcome for anything in your life, but particularly, negotiations. So I was a year out of business school, And I had gone to business school because I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to start my own business. And I did not leave business school with my brilliant idea. So I thought, well, let me get to work and start doing something I love, because I always get ideas when I'm doing something I love. So I went to work for a publishing company, and at the time it was the parent of Reidy. It was kind of my entree into entertainment. And while I was working there, I came up with an idea. I'll skip all the details, but I tried to get Variety to do it, and it didn't work out for Variety to do it. And I kind of sat on this idea and worked on it nights and weekends. And by the way, I got permission. I got a carve out from my contract to work on it. But I stewed on it for 2 years because I knew I needed about $1 million to get it going, to really get it going properly. And I didn't have $1 million. I was still paying off my school loans. And I was kind of stuck on the fundraising side. And I thought, what do I do? Like, I've worked with entrepreneurs, but I haven't been the one fundraising. Like, how do I even approach this? And I don't know if I'd call him a sponsor, but I was having a beer with a former colleague of mine from JP Morgan, and he's like, what are you up to? What's got you excited? I tell him about my idea, and he's like, great, like, what's the next step? I'm like, I have to raise $1 million. He's like, that should be so easy for you. And I was like, why would that be easy for me? He's like, well, you worked in investment banking, you've kept in touch with all those people, they all have extra money, why don't you just call them all up and ask them to invest in your business? And I was like, and he's like, well, how much do you need exactly? And at that time, I had not figured out exactly how much I needed.
Goes back to what you said, Ty.
So I just blurted out $1 million. And he's like, well, what's the minimum investment size? Which I had not also thought about. I was like, 25,000. I don't know why I picked that number. That was the number I said. He's like, well, I need to check with my wife, but if she says okay, like count us in for 25.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, so you want to invest in my business? Cool. And then I went home that night and I thought about this. I was like, wait, holy shit! Like, I've got an amazing network, and hold on, maybe I need to reframe this. I'm not asking for handouts here. I'm presenting people with a business opportunity. That actually seems like I'm doing them a favor by offering them a valuable business opportunity. And wait, they've worked with me before, so they know my work product. They know they can trust me. I'm good for it, And then it was like this cosmic shift of like, oh wait, I need to reframe this situation. So then, over the coming weeks, I actually called up all my JP Morgan people and some of my business school people and was like, hey, are you interested in this investment opportunity? And I got so many yeses. I got to 500,000 in not much time.
There you go.
And then at that point, I went to angel groups and had built up my confidence and really did some formal pitches. But it just goes to show, like, it doesn't matter how much you have on your resume, how many credits or whatever. It's like you have to get over that internal hurdle of like, what are you presenting, and how do you get yourself to a place where you're not asking for approval, you're presenting an opportunity, or you're believing in yourself. In my case, that got me the funding. And by the way, it was fall of 2008. During the Great Recession. Like, this was not a time
amazing.
that people wanted to be
amazing.
investing. But there's always a way. There's always a way if you have that kind of will.
Alicin, you have decades of experience making, sorry, is that true?
Not that many decades.
I already said I've been practicing law for 40 years, so I thought it was okay. I'm very impressed with her. That's what that meant. You have a lot of experience making cultures better, like working at companies. You are in a top level, probably, like, I want to say the top level position in our industry at Yahoo, and it takes money also. It takes a couple things. I'd love you to address a couple things. One, it takes getting that buy-in to really invest. We'll put the money aside for a minute, to make the investment in improving cultures, maintaining them, all the things that you know how to do. And it takes a financial investment. So talk to us a bit about, your career, your strategy, how you have done what you've done at this very high level.
Sure. Well, I mean, first what I'll say, and again, I say this, so I've been at Yahoo since the spring of 2022. I was Jim Lanzone's first hire since he'd become CEO. And I say that not to actually brag about me, but to actually brag on him for his understanding of how important culture is to building a business and a company. And so that alone was the reason, one of the things that it was so compelling to me about joining Yahoo, because of that understanding and that investment, and again, that expansive thought about what happens when you put people first, when you think about who's going to be making the things happen that need to happen in order to thrive. So, he had me at hello, right? I think I also oversee a brand called Makers, which is gender equity brand, and I'm really taken by both Thai and Jen's stories. But Jen, you were making me think about the challenge women have of thinking of themselves as actually making people better. We do it all the time, right? There's actually not a room that we go into where we leave it and the room's not better. And that's actually really important for everyone in this room to remember as well. And the notion that we actually are constantly doubting, whether or not we have something of value to offer, is absolutely something that we all have work to do. And it just throughout, wherever you are in your path, we constantly have to remind ourselves of that. And part of the work of Makers is to be why do we have to constantly remind ourselves of that? What's going on out there? And then the other thing is, we've had a number of small sort of closed door forums where women who are doing incredible things, building businesses, and there have been women in the room who've said, "But you haven't asked us for anything." And so it's very important. Yes, your network, because people know you and they trust you, and especially because you are building a business, something that it has value. We don't actually only have to ask our friends. Yeah. And that's the other thing that is really, really important in understanding investment and believing that you have something of great value to offer. And that goes to both having a business or having a skill, and certainly just, again, what you're able to contribute to a company or an organization.
I have to say, when I saw you get that role, it was a real testament to Yahoo and to you. But at a time when we're seeing such rolling back, some people call it backlash, but we're seeing people in similar roles at so many companies either being let go or leaving on their own accord. And so in 2022, when you've got this very high-level position as the first hire, that's a real testament to, as I said, both you and to Yahoo for recognizing how important this is. And I think all three of you can talk a little bit about the tie also between not only the moral, the ethical reasons that you should have a really diverse, inclusive, and equitable culture, but also the financial imperative. I remember being in a law firm years ago, and we were having a hard time getting this law firm to recognize the importance of this. And this very smart woman who did have some power at the firm, I remember her getting up on stage during a partner retreat, and she really talked about the economic, the benefit to the firm if the firm would really, because we're looking at a room of all white, I would always say white balding men. I remember sitting there going, oh my God, they're all like white balding men. And so she really talked about the economic, because she knew that some people would get it as it's good to be in environments that are like this. Other people, you needed to give them a financial reason. So talk a bit about, from your perspectives, the places that you work and how important that is.
So it's really interesting. The past, 8 years since I've been in LA, I've been in, ventures that have been labeled multicultural, if you will, in partnership with Kevin Hart. I'm on the board of Rock the Bells, LL Cool J's company, and then, the acting interim CEO. And so, but the beginning of my career was very different, right? In other in other arenas, both advertising, so WPP and Publicis, from a technology perspective, Sony and Meta, when there's still Facebook. And what the through line has been is, we've been forecasting this minority majority for some time, and now it's upon us where, by the year 2040, the majority of, U.S. citizens will identify as people of color. Gen Z is the most diverse generation globally ever. But if you just look one level below, 50% of the people on the planet, maybe closer to 51%, are women. And so, women are girls. And with women influencing 80% of consumer spending, like, we control the market. Like, we are the buyers, we are influencing the purchasing decisions. And since we're only 50% of the folks, that means even buying decisions that aren't ours, like the center of the household, the center of the community, are women, regardless of how, those households are configured. And so, I always tell folks, whether, I'm at Rock the Bells and we're, talking about advertising, and, our proposition is a multicultural, multi-generational audience that communicates through the foundation and the future of hip-hop storytelling. And hip-hop is infused and, has influenced pretty much every aspect of culture, from, what we view on screens to, what we listen to how we dress, what we eat. But ultimately, it's, if you want to future-proof your business, right, this is where you will have to invest. And I think sometimes that's why we see so much backlash and so much protection. I think so much of it is fear-based. I think that folks are very afraid of losing power. And if you think about how long those statistics have not been as they are, if you think about how much time and effort it takes to move the chains, even a little bit when it comes to gender inclusion or racial and ethnic inclusion, representation around sexual orientation, it is hard work that takes a long time, but often once those chains move, things are forever changed. And so I think what we're seeing and experiencing today is just a fear-based response and a protection of power. But ultimately, these new generations have very different ideals. They're both value and values-based, and if you look at what they prioritize, they will hold corporations to account, and so it's just good business to wake up and pay attention.
Alicin.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, just to piggyback on what Thai just said about sort of there's the fear of losing power, and also the notion that, there's been, and the fact that there has been, there's been incredible work and hard work that goes into making strides and forward momentum around underrepresented communities. The thing that I want to emphasize, and I think is really, really important to note, is that those strides have improved lives for everyone, right? There is absolutely not, there's nothing that has been created to make a marginalized person's life better that hasn't benefited everyone else. Right. Whether it's, you started something, it's like should be a small notion, but became very, very big, is like pronouns. Right? Like, that actually helps so many people to have pronouns in your email, right? And it's so but that, becomes like a little bit politicized. Or, curb cut effect, right? People talk about that all the time, that it was created for people in wheelchairs. Think about how often anyone uses the ramp onto a sidewalk, right? Like, these are closed captioning. So all of that is just, again, kind of this notion of being, in some cases fearful or certainly confused about what might be taken away, when in fact we're not talking about anything finite. It is not a pie, and it's not limited. It's actually just an abundance that happens when you sort of let go of what, again, going back to the innovation, what you have decided is fixed, as opposed to what actually reimagining how you can thrive. If women have more economic heft, that absolutely opens the aperture for everyone to be able to live their dream. Mm-hmm. My father-in-law has he was told he had to go raise a family. He had to pick, he had to identify, he was told he was going to Princeton, he was told he was going to be a corporate lawyer, And that's what he did. And he provided for his family. His wife stayed at home. He wanted to be a writer. Like, that was his dream. That's what he did after he retired. He started to write. And so this lifting all boats is not just sort of for the faint of heart. Economically, it is essential. I mean, to suggest that you're not going to think about who is not here but should be is basically saying, I don't care if my company is relevant or not. Like, that's at the end of the day what is being said. If you're saying, like, I don't care about inclusion, I don't care about expanding, who's thinking about using our product, who's thinking about being part of our community or our company. So it's extremely limiting and we'll see it play out, which is why I sort of think of some of these like statements. I mean, I never wanted to be the title Chief Diversity Officer because I always thought that people had a very myopic understanding of it. And now I can't get rid of it because now there's like so much attention to it. I don't want to because I want people to see what is possible when we think expansively about what it means when we're including and thinking about everyone to make sure that what we're designing, what we're creating is something that people want and will use and will thrive with.
Right, and they say that, the famous they say that cultures that are diverse, that are inclusive, that are equitable, tend to have people thrive, and there is more innovation because people aren't afraid to express their ideas and really banter those about. Jen, did you want to add anything before we go on?
Yeah, I mean, first, I just love what you had to say, and it made me think about how often our framing of inclusion is that it's at the expense of versus additive, and I'm going to remember the way you frame that because it makes so much sense. I mean, I think about it, back to your question of how is this good for business, and I think most of us in the room are probably in media, in entertainment, or providing platforms or services that support that. And I guess really coming off the election too, I'm thinking about this. We are really in a powerful place right now. And I feel, a great responsibility to bring diversity of thought and just inclusion into everything we're doing because we are influencing the stories and the characters and the storylines and the narratives that are out there in the world. And when I think about DE&I think about it not just gender equality, but really those diversity of perspectives, the diversity of just experiences, age, all the different factors, because it really, when you're in media and entertainment, if you're not reflecting your audience, you're not going to reach them. And most of us, at least Wondery, want to be a mass market opportunity. We want to be something that can reach broad audiences. But there's no way we can do that if we have a very narrow, myopic kind of focus of the world. But you only get that diversity if you have a team and people behind it that are thinking through all these different perspectives and challenging each other and taking risks and just trying to relay different points of view, really. So for me, it's just kind of essential for our business in media and entertainment to force that, to make sure that our teams are diverse across all the spectrums, because we can't create a good product for the world, without it.
Right. So we are coming off of, obviously, COVID and then dual strikes, and the film and television industry is terribly down. And so I think it would be really interesting to hear from all of you how to turn the challenge that many of the people in the room are facing with less work right now in TV and film. How to turn that challenge into an opportunity. What kinds of things could the women in this room be thinking about as they're trying to navigate this tough time in our business? Who would like to start on that one? Anybody want to jump in?
I'll just say really quickly, because I was, really moved by what Alicin and Jen said, the language around expansiveness, right? Like where all the town is talking about contraction. I'm going to take that language with me, because I think thinking about how to expand our minds, not just from an inclusion, but from an innovation perspective, is really important. And the other thing I'll say is that in a town of artists, we're now all being asked to become scientists, right? Where we're going to have to test and learn and iterate and innovate.
AI.
And what has been working isn't working anymore. So guess what? You guys are hyper qualified now to be the ones to bring new ideas to the table and to do things your way, because the town is desperate for new ideas and new ways of doing things right now.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say these times of adversity, these times when things are down, are actually the ripest times for innovation. And if you look at, back to my story, back in 2008 and the Great Recession, that's when a lot of amazing businesses got built. But think just more recently to COVID and how that global pandemic forced so many businesses to innovate, how we as individuals learn to work from home, adopt new habits, and do new things. In the podcasting space, we got talent into podcasting that would have never bothered with podcasting, except that TV and film were halted.
Right.
So they found their way into podcasting because they were bored, and they turned their closet into a recording studio and used Zoom to create a video podcast. It was like this incredible time. I couldn't have forced that type of innovation to happen unless we had a global pandemic. So I guess for individuals, I would think about, your broader skill set and what you love and how you can combine those things to find a gap in the market. What are you undeniably good at, or what is your company undeniably good at, and what are the adjacencies to that, but what are those pockets of white space where I'm good at this, and now I'm just going to pivot a little to the right or left, and I can innovate and start trying and testing. I think that's what happens during these downtimes, and it's just kind of allowing yourself that space to try.
I think the podcast industry is a great example. Absolutely. Did you have something?
I was just going to say the only other thing that I can add to what's already been shared is taking advantage, the disruption, right? That's part of the opportunity as well. Is that, and I've actually spoken to several women here who are already in the midst of that, and so disrupting, it's an opportunity to, as there's this lull, there's also this opportunity to shake it up and not have it be the same when it sort of picks up again. And that's this opportunity here that you can bring.
So I want to thank this amazing panel. I hope you enjoyed hearing them speak and you got some great insights, and it's a pleasure to have moderated all of you.